Well, back to our top story as we're watching for a key decision today for the rescue operation in Kabul. G7 leaders will be meeting this morning. The UK Prime Minister and summit host Boris Johnson will be asking the US President Joe Biden to keep American forces in Afghanistan past next week's August 31 deadline. Thousands of U.S. troops are guarding Kabul airport, and their withdrawal would mean the end of the evacuation flights. Justin Trudeau will be representing Canada at the G7 meeting and did not answer yesterday when asked whether Biden should push back the U.S. pullout. Well, for more, we're now joined by Denis Thompson. He's a retired Major General with the Canadian Armed Forces, also serving as NATO's commander of Task Force Kandahar in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. He joins us right now in Montreal. So, General Thompson, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin here with getting your impressions on what's happening on the ground. Now, government officials say that everything is being done to get people out of Afghanistan, but we really continue to hear contradictory accounts of people still waiting for days outside the airport perimeter, of being denied access by American forces to the airport, even though they have documents and Canadian passports. From what you're hearing, what is truly happening on the ground?
Well, if you'll permit me, I'll read a couple of stories very quickly.
Of course.
First is a good news story. Yesterday, a fully documented family whose father is already in Canada made it through a harrowing experience of accessing the airfield and flying out on a Canadian Armed Forces C-17 to safety. The family, however, is still in Afghanistan, obviously, made up of a mother and 3 young boys aged 14, 9, and 6. This was their third attempt in 3 days to access the airfield, fully documented, I remind you. The 2 previous failed efforts lasted more than 12 hours each and involved terror at successive Taliban barricades, beatings, and the near trampling of the young 6-year-old. It's doubtful that they would have attempted a 4th time had they not gone through. And the only reason they succeeded is because the 14-year-old boy, the senior son, if you will, has rudimentary English, which allowed them to navigate the process. That's a good news story. The not so good stories are continuing examples of families being split up. And I'm not talking about extended families. These are mothers and fathers and children. So in one case, a father and his children got through, but not the wife because she didn't have the appropriate paperwork. And in another case, it was the wife and kids that were turned away and only the father that made it through. So there are several examples that are frustrating our colleagues on the ground, our former interpreters and their deserving families on the ground, and it's starting to become critical because, of course, they're losing any sort of credibility. We're losing any sort of credibility we once had with them.
So when you hear the Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau, say that the government is doing everything that can be done to get people out of Afghanistan, what's your reaction to that then?
Well, my reaction is they need to change. They need to loosen up whatever the rule is that's being applied on the ground. At the tactical level, the measures that are being applied are too strict, they're not open enough, and they don't even meet the common sense test.
I'm also wondering about special forces, because we were told yesterday that special forces are now operating outside the perimeter, and this is to help people get into the airport. But since we do, as you just shared with us, continue to hear these stories of struggle, are there enough Canadian forces on the ground to help facilitate that process?
It's not a question of numbers of forces. It really is a bottleneck at the gates, that the entry points to the airfield. I'm not certain that any number of forces could fix that problem. Everybody is running the gauntlet, if you will, in order to access the airport. And the issue becomes, how do you do that if you're carting along young children or you have elderly parents? It's extremely difficult. I can see you're showing the images now. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't take much imagination to realize how difficult that is if you spend 12 hours under those conditions with no access to food, water, or frankly, washroom facilities, which is extremely difficult in that culture for women.
Now, we certainly have, sorry to interrupt, General.
No,
go ahead.
That's fine. It's just to say that I don't know that there is a way to fix this in the short term, given the problem set that the military has been handed.
Now, American forces, though, they are using helicopters to fly people into the airport. We're hearing of other countries using buses to get beyond those crowds and give some form of safety to get people to the airport. Is that a strategy that Ottawa should be, at this point, pursuing?
It's an option, but it's an option that requires negotiating with the Taliban, which would require a diplomatic footprint on the ground in Kabul, and I understand that we do not have that, whereas the embassies of France, the United States, and Britain closed their physical embassies, but they merely moved them inside the airfield. We do not have a diplomatic presence, to my knowledge, on the ground, or at least one that's capable of negotiating with the Taliban to allow things such as bus convoys to go through.
So what does that mean then? Because Canada is committed to taking 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan. Do you think this will happen then, given the challenges that we're seeing just a week away from the August 31st deadline? Or is that number just a quoted number for political reasons?
Well, we're not sure how much time we have. In the short term, we have to keep encouraging our Afghan contacts, these deserving families, to push through this horrendous ordeal that they have to do in order to get to the front of the queue and be selected for access to the airfield. If we're going to ask them to do that, we need a much more flexible entrance criteria. In other words, if they've started this so-called special immigration measure process, not finished it, just started it, and they're on one of the lists, then they should be admitted to the airfield, and we can sort all the paperwork out in a third-party location. If we are going to put a diplomatic presence on the ground, or we can do it remotely, then we should be negotiating with the Taliban to allow buses onto the airfield in the same fashion as some other nationalities have succeeded in doing.
Mm-hmm. So, General, there is going to be a virtual meeting a little later this morning of the G7 leaders. What are you looking out for? What are you hoping comes out of that meeting?
Well, I would think there would be broad general agreement that we could fix this access problem, and that those that have access to the Taliban could perhaps negotiate on our behalf. But this is something that's occurring at the tactical level, and I'm not sure it's really of concern to the G7 leaders. I imagine they're going to be talking about what do we do about this regime after this evacuation operation has wrapped up.
But one imagines, though, there will be pressure on Joe Biden to extend the deadline if it can be done beyond August the 31st, don't you think?
I don't think Mr. Biden is going to extend the deadline unless it involves American citizens. So that was the big push, to get American citizens out of Afghanistan. I don't know that they've been entirely successful. You'd have to ask them. But unless that number is greatly reduced, then I think you're right. They'll probably stay in place in order to make sure that the evacuation of American citizens continues. If that's the case, that's an opportunity for us to continue to find other ways to get people onto the airfield and fly them out to third-party countries. But we have to make sure that the criteria being applied at the coalface is reasonable, so that we admit these deserving families intact, not in parts and pieces.
General, thank you for that. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for keeping this alive. It's a very important issue to a lot of veterans across Canada.
Retired Major General Denis Thompson in Montreal.